The first time my mother chose a bottle over me, I was 16 and already grieving my father's death. The second time she chose it, she lost me forever. My grandmother Margaret found me in a shelter, thin, frightened, and wearing the same clothes I'd slept in for weeks. She promised I would never be abandoned again. I believed her. I buried my pain in textbooks, scalpels, and night shifts until the day I became a trauma surgeon. And then fate laughed because one storm-soaked night, the woman who destroyed my childhood was wheeled into my ER, barely breathing, and I was the only one who could save her. With 10 minutes on the clock, the past came roaring back, and my hands had to choose what my heart couldn't. My name is Daria Quinn, and I am 34 years old. I still remember the weight of black clothes, the smell of lilies, and the hollow silence that followed my father's coffin into the ground. At 16, you think the world still has corners where you can hide, but grief finds you everywhere. People kept touching my shoulder, whispering how strong I was, as if strength was something you could just decide to wear. My mother stood like stone beside me, eyes red, jaw tight, refusing to cry, refusing to look at me. That was the first day I felt truly alone, even while surrounded by people. I didn't know then that his death wasn't the end of my childhood. It was only the beginning of the slow unraveling of everything safe. After the funeral, the house changed before anything else did. The lights stayed off longer, dishes piled up, and voices lowered to murmurs that stopped when she walked in. Then came the sharp looks, the ones that landed on me like needles. She began to say it out loud. If I hadn't called him to pick me up that night, he wouldn't have been on that road. The sentence grew teeth each time she repeated it. She stopped cooking, stopped asking about school, and stopped saying goodnight. I started shrinking inside my room, trying to become quieter, smaller, impossible to blame. But grief doesn't need proof. It only needs a target. I became the nearest one, days blurred. The fridge emptied, but bottles kept appearing. She slept on the couch with the TV muttering to no one. I tiptoed through the house like a guest, making silent meals, washing dishes so she wouldn't hear the clatter. Sometimes she stared at me like she was trying to recognize a stranger who'd stolen her daughter and left a ghost behind. The silence felt worse than shouting. Silence meant I didn't matter enough to fight. I buried myself in homework, even when the letters swam from hunger. I kept hoping she would come back, the version of her who laughed, who hugged too tight, who braided my hair. Instead, the couch swallowed her deeper. The night everything broke, it was raining hard enough to erase the street. She came home hours after midnight, soaked, furious at a world she couldn't punch, so she punched with words instead. Every sentence was a blade, carving blame into the walls. When the bottle shattered, I flinched. When she said she wished I had died instead, something inside me went quiet. I packed a backpack with shaking hands and walked into the rain. I thought I'd come back in the morning. Instead, I followed a social worker into a building that smelled like bleach and old fear. They called it a shelter. I called it proof that I no longer had a home. Somewhere else in the city, an older woman with tired hands refused to sleep. She was my father's mother, and loss had sharpened her into determination. When calls went unanswered and visits turned cold, she started knocking on doors no one wanted to open. She asked questions that made people uncomfortable. Where is the girl? Who last saw her? Why didn't anyone help? Each dead end only hardened her resolve. She searched shelters, hospitals, churches, anywhere a child might disappear. She didn't care if people thought she was dramatic. She had already buried one child. She would not lose another to neglect and silence. They called my name in the shelter common room, and an unfamiliar fear rushed through me. I expected another intake interview, another stranger with a clipboard. Instead, I saw a woman whose eyes looked like home, lined with grief, filled with relief. She didn't scold. She didn't ask why. She just wrapped trembling arms around me and whispered, "You're safe now." I realized then how hollow I'd become, because the simple act of being held felt foreign. She noticed the clothes I'd worn for weeks, the bones showing through my cheeks, the way I flinched at sudden sounds. She didn't point any of it out. She just signed forms with steady hands and refused to let go. That night, I slept in a real bed with clean sheets that smelled like lavender. There was soup on the stove, light in the hallway, and the sound of someone humming while washing dishes. No yelling, no bottles, no blame. I kept waiting to be told it was temporary, that I needed to leave, that love came with conditions I couldn't meet. Instead, I was told to rest. I cried into the pillow not because I was sad, but because safety felt heavier than fear. A door had closed behind me, but another had opened. I didn't know where that path would lead. I only knew this: I was no longer alone. The bottles began appearing earlier each day, sometimes before the sun even thought about rising. She stopped pretending they were just for the bad nights and let them spill into the good ones too. Conversations turned into slurred monologues, then into silence, then into shouting matches with ghosts only she could see. The house smelled like sour liquor and regret. She forgot birthdays, appointments, and even meals. Instead of asking how her daughter was doing, she asked where the money was. Somehow, in her mind, every empty bottle was still the girl's fault. Neighbors looked away, whispering behind curtains but never knocking on the door. Addiction didn't arrive like a storm, it seeped in like dampness, rotting everything quietly until the floorboards of their lives began to sag and split. The words always came at night, when the house was dark and loneliness had teeth. She would stagger into the room and start reciting a list of sins that never existed, accusing the girl of stealing, lying, ruining lives. Insults were sharp and practiced, like a song she'd rehearsed too many times. Sometimes she cried while she said them, sometimes she laughed. The worst part wasn't the shouting, it was when she leaned in close and whispered that the world would have been better if that child had never been born. Those whispers burrowed deep, etching themselves into a heart already cracked by grief. By morning, she'd forget every word, but the girl never could. Courtrooms are colder than hospitals. They smell like paper and finality. She sat between lawyers and watched strangers discuss her life like it was a broken appliance. The mother arrived late, sunglasses hiding eyes that didn't want to see anything. Her voice trembled only when she talked about her own pain, never the child's. The judge spoke in calm sentences, asking questions about income, stability, safety. Safety. The word echoed in the girl's chest. When custody shifted toward the grandmother, relief and guilt collided inside her like two cars on the same road. She wasn't choosing sides, she was choosing survival. The mother didn't look at her once. Not when the decision was read, not when the gavel fell, not when it was already too late. Strong people don't always look strong. Sometimes they sit in locked bathrooms with the shower running so no one hears them cry. That became her ritual. Each sob was a confession she couldn't speak out loud. That she missed the mother who used to braid her hair, that she wondered if love was temporary, that she feared she really was to blame. By day, she smiled politely and said she was fine. At night, the mask slipped, pillowcases stayed damp, dreams replayed cruel words in loops, yet every morning she got up, went to school, and did her work. Strength, it turned out, wasn't loud. It was the quiet decision to keep going when every part of you wants to fade away. Schools have their own ecosystems, and gossip is the oxygen. Students noticed the tired eyes, the clothes that didn't always fit, the lunches that sometimes never came. Rumors grew legs and started running. She was trouble, she was broken, she was strange. Teachers whispered too, thinking she couldn't hear. Pity is just another form of distance. So she built a small island around herself, made of library books and notebook margins, speaking only when necessary. A few kind faces tried to bridge the gap, but shame is a stubborn guard dog. It kept barking that she didn't belong. No one knew the truth, that each day she arrived at school wasn't a weakness. It was proof she refused to disappear. Her grandmother never promised what she couldn't give. But one evening, while they washed dishes together, she made a vow that sounded like a lifeline. She said the past was a chapter, not the whole book. She said the girl's life would be built on love, not fear. They would find therapy, stability, scholarships, anything needed to rebuild. For the first time, the girl heard someone speak about her future like it existed, like it could even be bright. That promise wasn't loud or dramatic, it was simple. We move forward together. She didn't fully believe it yet, but she wanted to. And sometimes, wanting hope is the first step toward having it. Eventually, waiting becomes its own kind of grief. They waited for apologies that never came, for phone calls that never rang, for sobriety that never stuck. One day, the grandmother quietly removed the last photograph from the mantel and placed it in a drawer. No speeches, no anger, just acceptance. The girl watched and understood. They weren't erasing the mother, they were letting go of the fantasy version who might return. It hurt like losing her all over again, yet it also brought a fragile peace. The door to the past didn't slam, it clicked shut softly. And in that silence, space opened for something new, a life not defined by abandonment, but by what they chose to build next. The idea didn't arrive like lightning. It crept in slowly, during doctor visits and sleepless nights, when she watched kind hands steady people who were falling apart. Healing felt like the opposite of what she'd lived through. She wanted to be the person who showed up when others didn't. College counselors warned her that medicine was brutal, competitive, unforgiving. They asked if she was emotionally ready. She didn't tell them that pain had been her teacher long before textbooks. Instead, she nodded, took the stack of forms, and began mapping a path that looked impossible on paper. It wasn't about prestige. It wasn't about money. It was about turning her scars into instruments of compassion, taking what had nearly destroyed her and reshaping it into purpose. Her life narrowed to flashcards, highlighters, and the soft hum of a desk lamp at 2 a.m. while others slept. She memorized systems, pathways, and chemical names that curled around her tongue like foreign languages. Coffee became a companion. Doubt became an intruder she learned to ignore. Sometimes she'd pause, hands around a warm mug, and wonder if she was chasing something too big for someone like her. But then she'd remember the shelter, the courtroom, the long nights of fear, and how someone had once believed she could do more. Each exam was a small battle won. Each acceptance letter was a doorway opening wider. She wasn't running from the past anymore. She was building something beyond its reach. Medical school didn't care about backstories. It cared about stamina, precision, and the ability to function while exhausted. The first time she held a cadaver's hand, she whispered thank you, honoring the life that would teach her to save others. She worked shifts that bled into mornings and studied during bus rides, meals, and stolen minutes between lectures. Some classmates had parents who were doctors and never worried about rent. She had grit and a grandmother who left notes in her lunch reminding her to eat. When she felt invisible, patients noticed. They saw the way she listened without rushing, the way her eyes softened when they spoke of fear. Those moments stitched her confidence back together piece by fragile piece. Failure came for her more than once. A critical exam went badly. A supervisor questioned whether she was cut out for this. Those words echoed old wounds she thought had healed. Panic clawed at her chest, threatening to drag her back into the darkness of not enough. But this time, she didn't hide. She asked for help. She met tutors, practiced procedures until muscle memory replaced hesitation, and learned that competence is often just persistence in disguise. Fear never vanished, it simply learned to sit quietly in the corner while she worked. She realized that being a good doctor wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up, again and again, even when your hands are still shaking. The day she received her white coat felt unreal. It rested on her shoulders like both a responsibility and a blessing, heavier than it looked. Applause filled the hall as names were called, but all she heard was the steady beat of her own heart. Her grandmother cried openly, unashamed, clutching tissues like confetti. There were no parents pushing forward for photos, no biological family cheering, yet she didn't feel empty. She felt chosen by the life she had fought to create. The coat wasn't a costume. It was a promise to every frightened patient who would sit across from her, hoping for answers. She vowed silently that she would always listen, because she knew what it meant when no one did. The emergency room introduced itself with alarms. Metal carts rattled, doors slammed open, voices layered over one another like chaotic music. There was no easing in, only jumping head first. Her first patient cried silently, gripping her hand as monitors blinked in frantic rhythm. Training took over where fear tried to bloom. She spoke calmly, even when adrenaline thundered through her veins. After the crisis passed, she stood in the supply room for a moment, letting the reality wash over her. She had helped save a life, not perfectly, not heroically, but steadily, compassion guiding skill. For the first time, she understood why doctors stayed despite the exhaustion, because moments like that change you, years wove into experience. Nurses trusted her judgment. Families recognized the sincerity in her eyes. She didn't raise her voice or chase glory. She simply did the work with careful hands and a patient heart. Word spread that she was the doctor who stayed late, who explained diagnoses without rushing, who treated every person like they mattered. Quiet respect followed her down hospital corridors. Still, nights were long. Trauma didn't wait for holidays or rest. Yet each case reminded her why she'd chosen this path, to rewrite a story that once felt doomed. She had learned to heal without hardening. And though she rarely spoke of the past, it lived inside her as both warning and fuel. The trauma pager screamed through the quiet hum of the ER, flashing red across the screen. Multi-system injuries, critical, ETA 10 minutes. That meant chaos, blood, broken bones, and decisions that couldn't wait for certainty. She washed her hands, tied her mask, and stepped into the familiar storm of rushing nurses and rattling stretchers. Routine steadied her checklist, instruments, command. Then the paramedics burst through the doors, voices overlapping as they transferred the patient onto the table. She focused on vitals first, then the face beneath the oxygen mask. Something inside her shifted, a small, cold drop of dread falling straight through her chest. The world didn't tilt. It froze, the mask slid aside for a moment, and the truth hit harder than any alarm. The woman on the table, bruised, bloodied, fragile, was the mother who once wished her away. Time folded in on itself. For a breathless second, she wasn't a surgeon. She was a terrified teenager again, standing in the rain with a backpack and nowhere to go. Her colleagues kept talking, injuries cataloged, orders shouted, but their voices sounded distant, underwater. She stared at the face she had avoided in memories for years and felt two realities collide: the doctor trained to save lives, and the abandoned child who had barely survived on her own. Memories didn't knock. They barged in, the shards of glass on the kitchen floor, the bottle rolling under the couch, the sentence that sliced her open that she should have been the one to die. She remembered hunger, fear, and the hollow echo of footsteps that never came to check on her. And yet, she also remembered a different version. The mother who once sang while cooking, who kissed scraped knees, who tried before the grief swallowed her whole. Those fragments crashed together as she stared at the monitors. She felt the room wobble, then forced air into her lungs. The past had sharp claws, but right now life, even this life, hung in the balance. A senior surgeon stepped closer, voice steady but cautious. "Do you want me to take this one?" It wasn't just kindness, it was policy. Doctors weren't supposed to treat close family. Her heart pounded so loudly she could feel it in her throat. Stepping back would be understandable, expected, safe. But as she looked at the broken body on the table, she realized something terrifying. She didn't feel revenge. She felt responsibility, not as a daughter, as a doctor. All the years of study, all the nights she promised to show up for people who had no one, this was that promise being tested. She took a slow breath and said she would proceed. The CT scan was brutal. Internal bleeding, collapsing lung, fractures everywhere. They had minutes, not hours. Consent forms blurred, the anesthesiologist prepared intubation. The team waited for her decision, surgery now, or there would be no later. 10 minutes, that was all. 10 minutes to choose, not whether her mother deserved saving, but whether she could carry the weight of being the one to try. Her hands hovered above the sterile field, gloved and trembling. She remembered every patient who had ever looked at her with desperate eyes. She thought of the grandmother who fought so she could become this person. And then the trembling stopped. She nodded once, crisp and controlled. The operating room flooded with motion, instruments passed, monitors adjusted, a rhythm of practiced urgency. Her voice didn't shake as she called each step, guiding the team through the narrowing tunnel between life and loss. Under the harsh surgical lights, the woman on the table was no longer a monster from her past. She was simply a fragile human body fighting to hold on. There was blood, panic, moments where the line between success and tragedy thinned to a thread. And through it all, she anchored herself to one truth: compassion wasn't weakness. It was strength sharpened by pain, hours stretched and folded into each other. The room smelled of antiseptic and iron. Every decision felt like walking a tightrope without knowing if there was a net below. There were complications, there always are, but the team moved like a single organism, responding to her calm commands. When the bleeding finally slowed and the monitors steadied into a fragile rhythm, the tension loosened from her shoulders all at once, leaving exhaustion in its place. The surgery wasn't a miracle. It was a chance, thin, precious, and uncertain. She stepped back, eyes stinging, realizing she had just saved the woman who once broke her heart, and that the hardest part was still ahead. Just when she thought the hardest part was over, everything changed. Stay with me, and if you're new here, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The waiting room buzzed softly with machine noise and whispered conversations, but for her, time moved like syrup. Hours ago, she had been inside the storm, every second filled with purpose. Now there was only the ache of uncertainty. A nurse finally approached, eyes gentle. The surgery had gone as well as it could. Survival was possible but not promised. She thanked the team in a steady voice that surprised her. When she stepped outside, night had given way to the bruised blue of early morning. The air smelled like rain and asphalt. She leaned against a wall and let the truth settle in. She had done everything she could, not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but because choosing compassion meant choosing the person she had fought so hard to become. When she walked into the recovery room later, the bed felt enormous around the fragile body lying in it. Tubes whispered, monitors blinked, and the steady beep of borrowed time echoed through the sterile air. Sitting quietly in the corner, she watched the rise and fall of a chest that had once shouted terrible things, then fallen silent for years. Strangely, she felt neither hatred nor forgiveness, only distance, like watching a storm far out at sea. This woman had been the beginning of her story, but she no longer controlled the ending. She stood up, adjusted the blanket, and whispered the only truth she could manage. "I hope you find peace." Then she walked out, carrying none of the weight with her. That night she sat at her kitchen table with a blank page and a pen that hovered uncertainly. Words came slowly at first, fragments of memories, grief, anger, and the hollow spaces where love should have been. She wrote about hunger and fear, about sleeping with shoes on in case she had to run. She wrote about the grandmother who stitched her life back together with patience and tea. She admitted that despite everything, part of her had always waited for an apology. By the final paragraph, the tears stopped. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, not to mail, but to mark the moment when she finally said what needed saying, even if the person it was meant for never heard it. A few days later, she visited the quiet cemetery where her father rested beneath a modest stone and a blanket of fallen leaves. She sat cross-legged in the grass and spoke softly, the way she had as a child. She told him about school, about the ER, about the woman she had become. She told him about the night when life came full circle and how she had chosen to save instead of destroy. The wind stirred the trees, and for the first time her guilt lifted like fog under sunlight. His death had not been her fault. It had never been. She placed a single flower at the base of the stone and stood up lighter than she had arrived. When she returned home, the smell of soup and the low hum of an old radio wrapped around her like a blanket. Her grandmother didn't ask for details. She simply opened her arms, and that was enough. The embrace was steady, familiar, the same anchor that had kept her afloat through storms she once believed would drown her. They sat together at the table, hands wrapped around warm mugs, sharing comfortable silence. No speeches, No dramatic declarations, just the quiet reassurance that real family is built from choice and effort, not just blood. In that ordinary evening, more healing happened than in any hospital room or courtroom. Love, it turned out, didn't need to be loud to be powerful. In the weeks that followed, life didn't turn magical, it simply became honest. She returned to work, to patients who needed gentle explanations and steady hands. Some nights were still long, some memories still whispered, but she no longer carried bitterness like a second skin. Forgiveness wasn't a door she flung open, it was a window she cracked just enough to let fresh air in. She stopped asking why things had happened and started asking what she could build from them instead. Peace didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in small moments: a laugh shared with a nurse, a sunrise scene from the hospital roof, a quiet drive home with the windows down. One evening, a frightened teenager arrived in the ER, hungry, alone, clutching a worn backpack like armor. She knelt beside the stretcher, meeting scared eyes with calm kindness. In that instant, she understood the true meaning of full circle. She couldn't rewrite her own past, but she could shape someone else's future. And that was its own kind of justice. She didn't need apologies or revenge to feel whole. She had already chosen who she wanted to be: a healer, a survivor, a woman who turned pain into purpose. As the automatic doors slid open to the night outside, she realized she had finally been freed, not from her history, but from its hold on her.